Welcome to Speak with Eve. I'm your host, Eve Eurydice. Today, my friend Porochista Khakpour, the writer of Tarantulas, is going to join me in talking about Luigi Mangione. Welcome to the show, Porochista.
I'm so happy to be back.
You and I were had a date to talk about the results of the election.
Oh my God, yeah.
What a devastating but unsurprising outcome. And then right after the election, this came up, and I think this topic is meant for us.
Well, it's funny though, because actually this news item does kind of involve a lot of the election topics. It touches on, I think, the chaos of like the response, which has been surprising only for I think officials, or it's some of the press also seem weirdly surprised. But anyone who paid attention to the American public's dissatisfaction with basically everything, this could really see it coming, and you could see it coming from the voters all the way through this. And I have a feeling this isn't going to be the last event that also shows what some might regard as a surprising outcome, but to a lot of us who are paying attention, seems actually quite rational.
In a sense, the people who voted against Trump and the people who voted against Kamala, either third party or for Trump, out of just disgust of the lack of options, they are represented in this outburst, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Revolutions do begin with killings and murderers and wars, including world wars.
Yeah.
There is so much symbolism in this one outburst of violence.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just go through the timeline for everyone who may not be caught up. November 24th, Luigi Mangione reportedly goes from Atlanta to New York City. He has a fake ID as Mark Rosario. He goes to a hostel. He always wears a mask. He takes it off to smile beautifully and seductively at the young desk clerk. So that's the key piece of evidence. First time his face is exposed. December 4th, there is the killing outside the Hilton in midtown Manhattan. Luigi Mangione was there. It was around 5:35 a.m. He went by e-bike. He left by e-bike. He got a coffee at the Starbucks and sat on a bench waiting for Mr Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, to emerge. Then he went through Central Park on the e-bike, got rid of his backpack, which had Monopoly money in it. He took a taxi to the George Washington bus terminal, left the city. Then December 9th, which is 5 days later, at 9:15 a.m., a worker at Altoona McDonald's called the police and said that someone who looked like the suspect, whose picture was all over the news, was there, and he was arrested by police shortly thereafter with a 9mm pistol with a silencer, a home-printed weapon, and a handwritten notebook, which has been called the manifesto, expressing hostility against the healthcare industrial complex and executive CEOs. And there was a tip from a missing persons report that was filed on November 18 by his mom in San Francisco. So the photo from the missing persons report was already in the system, and that brought it all together. Since he was arraigned in Pennsylvania, he has been brought to New York City by helicopter in a military posse, in a huge show of force. Totally overkill, like a phalanx, and which only elevated him to look more like a martyr. Christ-like, he was unarmed. He was surrounded by all of these big giant men in bulletproof vests and the mayor. And the police wanted it filmed. They called the Associated Press there. So, and he's now held in the same downtown Brooklyn jail where pleaded is held, and has been charged not just with the state murder, but also federal murder and terrorism charges.
Right.
Which is a charge that hasn't even been used in mass shootings against church parishioners or synagogue goers. To my knowledge, this is the first time where a single murder of one individual has been charged as terrorism. I guess against all CEOs.
Right.
Those are the facts, and you and I are very interested in the public response to it and how he was an instant folk hero.
And I got berated online about this. When actually I got an apology from the same person who berated me today, in fact. But I had a former student of mine who was a very left-leaning, definitely progressive thinking individual who, I made a joke, like everybody was making jokes, of course, and I think a lot of us were fixated on like how funny it was that he looked like a movie star himself. So I made a joke like looking for a man with Luigi energy, some ridiculous joke like that. And my student was just like, no, the murder is not funny. And so we had this whole long back and forth where he kept saying murder is not funny. And I said, well, yeah, you should be very upset by the United Healthcare CEO's, track record against, human life. And this just went back and forth for hours one night a couple weeks ago. And then today my former student finally said like, oh, you know what? I'm so sorry. Like I kind of got caught up on the whole thing and I see where you were coming from. But for the most part, everybody, including like politicians like Elizabeth Warren, took the stance of like, well, you can only push people so far. So there was this general mainstream acknowledgement that our healthcare industry, as you said very properly, a healthcare industrial complex is an evil homicidal machine that for ages now has been brutal to the American public. I think if this murder had happened prior to COVID, we might have had a different response. But I think like even I have noticed as someone who's chronically ill and someone involved in disability rights activism work, I've noticed there's a huge shift in sort of mainstream American public discussions about healthcare because so many more people are sick or someone in their close proximity is sick. Everyone has experienced COVID at least once, or it's been in their world or they've just been witness to like insane fatality rates that were some of the worst in the world. And so like we know it's not a secret that the healthcare industry is broken. So I think it's funny that like then there was this response that maybe none of us even anticipated, but it was just very clear, bold response. You rarely see the left and right unify over anything these days, but here you had it. It sent the message loud and clear. And so the people that were pearl clutching, I just really wonder about them. Like, what on earth are you talking about? I mean, I rejoiced only in the part of it that was like, wow, we're actually unified. And I sort of see everyday people like normie grandmas, like even just joining us in wanting to fight back against a system that does not care about their life. So anytime there's any of that, like I think it's a good sign. I definitely saw that when the whole country was unified against the Democrats. You can see it in an issue like Gaza, for instance. You have lots of people on left and right, in fact, who are like, we don't want our tax money going to the murder of civilians. Like, that's not something we signed up for. So there have been these issues in recent history that have, you could say radicalized some people, but for me, what's more important is that it's unified a lot of this country at a time where our divisions are so intense. So that was the part I was really excited about because I knew he was going to get caught. I knew he was going to get caught. I know the end for this young man is not going to be a good one. He's a folk hero, but like it's tragic to me that someone of his intelligence, of his good ethics, again, I know some people will be upset to hear that of how could a murderer have good ethics, but he does. I mean, his tiny 262 word manifesto shows you that his concerns were in the right place. You could debate like if his actions were, but certainly his concerns were. And the fact that we have lost this young man, either to the death penalty or whatever, just the life lost behind bars, is a tragedy. But I did think it's very telling that you just didn't see this outcry of like sympathy for this like 50-year-old healthcare CEO, and also like the United Healthcare specifically had such a bad reputation that all of the country was like, they had stories, you had doctors, nurses, everybody commenting everywhere, to the point where the New York Times had to say publicly that they're not running his image anymore because the public is too sympathetic towards him. So it's like, that says it all.
There was an amazing song supporting him on TikTok that TikTok removed within an hour, which, by the way, I will try to play at the end of this podcast.
Great,
so people
I love
can
those.
hear it. I saved it because TikTok, of all places, where a lot of his support has been most vocal, took it down and muted that unknown person's song. What you're saying, the unity between the two sides, in-laws who voted for Trump. They are huge Luigi fans.
Oh, wow,
You have
yeah.
people buying T-shirts, like Luigi retro T-shirts, or all the merch just disappearing.
Yeah.
The candles, where he's the patron saint of the uninsured. This stuff
Right.
was completely unexpected. I think that even those of
Yeah.
us who have been vocal in our politics, who were disappointed by Bernie, a
Right.
big number of people who determined this election, I think, were
Right.
people like us who would not vote for the Democrats because of the war and because of the way that they sold the country out on health insurance. This campaign was the first campaign that I remember since Clinton, since Hillary was vilified for wanting to solve healthcare and come up with some sort of universal health care. And
Right.
then Obama promised it, betrayed the American people, and sold us out, made it worse than ever.
Yeah.
Then Trump said, well, I'll make it better. This time around, no one talked about it. It was like a non-issue.
Yeah.
That has
Right.
been resolved.
Right. It's so funny. I mean, it says it all that it was absent from the discussion completely.
Yeah.
It's shocking.
Yeah. They did not expect the anger from all sides. I have wealthy friends who had United Healthcare and say it's the devil. In a sense, it's an economic issue, but it's not a clear-cut class issue or racial issue, and that's why the support has been so unanimous.
Yeah, and he's like the perfect person, because I love when it was revealed that he's not even like he's from a pretty affluent background. His family is one of the more wealthy families in Maryland, like in the Baltimore area, I think Towson specifically. So his family has been involved in resorts and developments and all sorts of things. Like he comes from actual money. He went to a pretty good all boys private school, and then went to an Ivy League university. Like, this is a privileged person actually talking about his problems with healthcare. I mean, we know that he had a chronic condition. We know, or a couple at least. He had a back condition since he was a child. It turns out he also had Lyme disease. So we know that he's been dealing with the healthcare system for quite a while, but he's someone that you would assume that his family could pay the problem away, but clearly not. I mean, you can't, there's no amount of money in the US that you could have that would somehow make you like be in the clear should you have a health problem.
Exactly.
We don't have a functional healthcare system. It's embarrassing. It's on the list with some of these very like marginal countries that people have barely heard of when they look at like what countries have the worst healthcare system. I do think it was kind of great also that it's not like, that he's also someone that comes from privilege and wealth. And so like that just drives the point all the more.
The self-sacrifice, I think, is what, moved people in a way that part wasn't there. If he was just an angry or aggrieved anarchist or bigot.
Right.
But it was the fact that he was willing to sacrifice everything he was, all his privileges, to make this point, and that the victim was not an individual. He was a symbol. And the public understood that in a way that the media refuses to understand. The second one of your points, the public understands that this is an American problem because we're surrounded, we have Canada, we have Europe, we have most of the world. You can get healthcare that is free or very cheap. Even people with money will travel to like Colombia or Mexico or Canada.
Right.
Personally, I go to Greece because the cost of healthcare is hundreds or thousands of times more here. So you wonder why. It's not something that's a mystery to the public.
Exactly. And I think that's also like, there's a real gift in his identity being like what it was. I think that's why the story just keeps on delivering too. I mean, there's also something kind of nice, of course they combed through his social media and the aftermath of his discovery. But there's also something kind of great there where he couldn't be categorized as distinctly right or left, which again, like I said, with the election, there were tons of voters who were not identifying with either. I do think it's going to become an a sort of bigger issue as the years go by, that there's going to be this larger mass of people that don't identify with any positions, but just identify with a general dissatisfaction. And so I've heard him be called like one of like the gray tribe. That's sort of a new term for me, but I think it's one of these terms that came out of the techlash, of the last few years. The tech world no longer was seen as just like a positive world only. But I think what kind of categorizes this gray tribe is that they're people that they're identified as sort of very educated, intelligent people who, some of them have some links to Silicon Valley, some don't, but they have some interest in like esoteric knowledge, and that they probably, their most definitive feature is that they fall outside of left and right. And so you can't look at their social media and say, oh, because this always happens in the aftermath of a shooting, right? Talk about another American problem, right? Our constant shootings. Immediately people will come social media to say, oh, okay, this was a right-wing guy. Okay, this was a left-wing person. Everybody does this on both sides. But with him, you couldn't really do that. It was all over the place. And so that's where this kind of very new discussion of this gray tribe emerging has come in. And then even his like ethnicity, like being Italian American, is pretty interesting too, because again, it doesn't fit into, even with the terrorism charge, we're so used to people like from my part of the world, immediately the Middle Eastern person being involved, or there's all these identities in the US that have sort of like kind of like an alert attached to them, and it's been some years, some decades since Italian Americans have been the sort of focal point of American bigotry. So that also was kind of interesting. So it's like an identity that's sort of a little bit out of the attention of people who want to cry either discrimination or bigotry. So there's so many things around his identity that make him like the perfect person for something like this, and then add to it his like very like his perfect optics, whole world of women online especially who have been enchanted by his good look.
Crush on him. Everybody has a crush on him. And then there are like look-alike contests. A friend of mine who's from wealthy Baltimore family went to a birthday party and he had the Luigi Mangione theme. So it was like all the party favors. The cake had an image of him.
Wow.
The decoration was like
my God. Amazing.
The media, they have no idea. And these terrorism charges are just gonna open the door. And the question is, will he have decent lawyers, right? I don't know. His lawyers now with the terrorism charge can actually put the entire health insurance industry on trial and argue that Mangione was defending the public from a predatory CEO who profited off killing and bankrupting the people. So it's like Robin Hood storyline. That could be his defense. So if that's what he intended. It could be like the OJ trial 2.0, the OJ trial of this century. Apparently, there is a possibility for a jury nullification defense, meaning that people can be sworn in as jurors and sit through the trial in good faith, and then decide at the end that these charges, that the crime did not match the charges that were brought against him. There has been discussion in the past that the OJ trial verdict was jury nullification verdict, that they just thought that the charges were not the right ones considering the conditions. So the jury can actually say we're nullifying these charges.
Oh, wow.
The legal charges are hereby nullified and he can walk. That's really, up to the public. The backlash can be so huge if there is a big televised trial, and if his lawyers do him justice, the jury will feel justified, and it is legal to do this, but the jury may feel justified to just nullify the whole thing, which is related to what you said in the beginning, that the result of the election is not disconnected with this case. The powers that be, the media, the Democrat elite, have not understood that a lot of the vote that went Trump's way, and of course Trump has not understood that. He thinks it's his ideas. The vote that went for him was the vote of people who saw him victimized by the DOJ, who thought that this was overkill. The DOJ with FBI agents with orders to shoot entered without bigger cause his home. Whether or not his home is a billionaire home is beside the point. They turned him into the same victim that the people feel that they are in connection to the government. So I think that this election would not have happened had it not been for people trying to shoot at him, the government parading him in front of court after court on charges that seemed overblown, whether it was the E. Jean Carroll case, which you can't change the law in a state just for 1 year, so that the statute of limitations doesn't count for 1 year, so that you can have a billionaire who owns LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, pay the costs so you can hire the best lawyer and bring in a case that otherwise could not have been brought against a citizen legally. The people are not stupid. The public is not stupid. There was a lot more that went Trump's way as a response to the bullying by the government and by the DOJ than it had anything to do with Trump, his policies, his previous stint as a president. It was a protest vote. And I think the same thing is going to happen now. And they are not getting it. When you watch the news or read the New York Times, it is just not understanding how huge and strong this feeling is.
Totally. I think you make such a good point here, because the public really can't stomach these displays of force from the federal government. This is not something that's impressive. And I think in an example you brought up, it's really well displayed in that perp walk when the helicopter landed. I mean, they had the choice to make that a much more discreet transfer, which is how it usually goes. But instead, they had this very staged event so that you, again, saw him, handcuffed and all orange, flanked by all these officials and policemen and bulletproof and machine guns and all this stuff. And the New York mayor, who's usually absent, behind him. I mean, it was ridiculous. And it backfired. They were wanting to use him as an example to send a message. But I think the message that is sent was the absolute opposite. That it actually made him look better. Like, it made him look, like you said, a martyr. He just looked graceful without any weapons, walking alongside all these men overreacting, just like you could argue the same overreacting that led to, the whole Trump phenomenon this time around. These sort of displays of force through officials, it just doesn't work anymore. And I think people often think, Americans are only anti-police in the defund the police, like leftist, progressive sense. But that's not even the case. I mean, Americans have always been dissatisfied with the police. I mean, nobody likes getting little tickets for minor issues. There's no world in which anyone valorizes the police. I mean, the fact that, even as a child, I was listening to regular radio stations, pop music radio stations, and they were playing Cop Killer. That was that was a sign back then, even, that there was a lot of anti-police bias. Why was even Rodney King's beating even filmed? People knew back then to not trust the police. So people don't love these authorities. And Americans have always been anti-establishment and iconoclastic and against the system. That's supposed to be the real spirit of America. Certainly what I hoped, as a child here. And so I think that's the America that a lot of us know and love. And the America that Donald Trump has kind of capitalized on, because he always presents himself as anti-system and anti-establishment, whereas we know he really isn't. But he manages.
The mugshot was the beginning. He managed to somehow make himself a representative of the underdog, even though he's, the billionaire. He's a product of the toxic celebrity culture. But he was very smart, even with the McDonald's apron. Working class. He did this. The Democrats lost the game. They became party of the elites and somehow. And so, of course, they would have lost. They supported the military-industrial complex. They supported big pharma complex. I mean, even their support for trans rights, which we are for. It went so far where it was they were supporting the right of pharmaceutical companies to provide subsidized hormonal therapy to underage individuals against the protestations of the Republicans. What? Wait, until yesterday, we were the people who were suspicious of big pharma. And they ceded that. So it's not a political issue. They're trying to politicize it. That will eventually backfire. The Kyle Rittenhouse case was a 17-year-old in 2017. That shooting. The Daniel Penny case now in the subway. The media is saying, they're the bad guys because they're right-wing heroes. I think that's wrong. I think that the same support is across the board with some exceptions reactions among people, fanatics, politicized fanatics. But I think the sentiment is the same, that you're for the individual breaking out in some way against a greater overpowering system. And that's why you have like the posters, that are popping up all over New York City or online of like other CEOs. That's why you had like the copycat, or the poor lady here in Florida who was denied coverage. And she said, you saw what happened to the United Care CEO. They're coming, or we're coming for you next. And she gets arrested and thrown in jail.
Crazy. God.
The civil liberties fight goes on in this context. People have to be able to speak up against the censorship, industrial censorship complex, which is now represented by all the big news media.
Yeah, the failure of the media is a big one here, and was during the election too. I mean, the media thinks it's doing its job in not taking sides or presenting some sort of objective reality, but I mean, nobody is fooled by that anymore. And so the media ends up representing a position that doesn't really exist anywhere, that no one is really uttering. So it just becomes like a vacuum in itself. I think a lot of us returned back on social media when this happened because we knew the social media discourse was going to actually be more reflective of the general public. Whereas, in the last few years, there's been times where people are like, well, Twitter is not real life. I would say, especially in this case, the reactions I saw on Twitter do reflect the people that I know in real life. I think there's just, people are going to be very surprised, or the media is at least, of like the anger that people have and how this anger is going to be represented onward, as all these issues become less and less solvable, like from climate change to, God knows what, healthcare, that people are going to find all sorts of ways to express their anger. And it's not going to necessarily be in a way that the media or like people at the top, like these CEOs, are prepared for. Just can't turn back time. And I do think like COVID was a definitive, moment for some people. It definitely radicalized some people. But, you can't have a whole population go through that amount of like death and devastation, people dying at hospitals without being able to see their loved ones, on ventilators. Like that's a mass trauma that none of us have even processed yet. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be all sorts of reactions that are maybe going to make, the media or whatever uncomfortable. But I don't see this going anywhere. I mean, maybe the next guy that shoots a CEO isn't going to get quite the same response, or he might not be as handsome or whatever it is. These CEOs might be a little bit uneasy with who they are and what they're representing is a good thing. I mean, the tech world had to go through that too. And the billionaire class is going to be, under fire, and that makes sense, as they should be.
Oh, yeah. The other thing they don't understand is what's going to happen with AI or AGI.
Oh, yeah.
The coming of superintelligence, basically, which eventually will make almost all employment no longer needed.
Right.
So people will be subsidized in some way. Otherwise, there will be huge, massive unrest against the few who continue to profit. And I do think there is a religious element to this. I actually put out a tweet with like a photo of Luigi arrested by the police. His hands are tied in a very humble, pious way in front of him. Because of the handcuffs, he's in the orange uniform that looks like a generic piece of cloth. Speaking of the police, there they are. He's looking downward and he's walking in these tiny steps, and he's surrounded by the guards. To me, as someone raised in Christian iconography, this was modern religious iconography.
That's
I have
so
not seen something that was so similar to Christ being arrested and going to be tried, and then in front of Pontius Pilatus and then hung. Right? So all of these things are symbols that are 2,000 years old, and they hit people in places that are hard to put in words, but they are very potent important. And then his manifesto, which, as you said, was so short, he basically wrote, the U.S. has the number one most expensive healthcare system in the world, yet we rank 42nd in life expectancy. Then in the next page, he wrote that United is the largest company in the U.S. by market cap, behind only Apple, Google, and Walmart, which I didn't know.
Right.
It has grown and grown since Obamacare became the law, but as for our life expectancy, it has gotten shorter and shorter. They have got too powerful, and they've continued to abuse that power for immense profit. And the American public allows them, or has allowed them, to get away with it. So that's what he said. He said, because the American public has allowed them to get away with it. Obviously, the problem is very complex, and he doesn't pretend to be the most qualified person to present the full argument, but the corruption and the greed are incontestable. And then he quoted writers who have written books about this decades ago. And he said, clearly it's not an issue of awareness at this point, but power games at play.
Right.
And his last line was, evidently, I am the first to face this with such brutal honesty.
Yeah, which is pretty perfect. I mean, he wrote a concise statement that really gets on every point pretty well. Like, I really liked his, if you can even call it a manifesto. But, I don't know if you saw the fake manifesto that was going around. It's very bloated, sort of lengthy.
The fake one.
The very strange and sentimental stuff about his mother and all that stuff. So that was discredited pretty fast. But, yeah, I feel like this was just, like, very well stated. And it really is a tragedy to lose him as an activist, a potential activist in various circles. But I think people are worried that he's going to radicalize new people, but I think the new people are already there.
Oh, yeah, everybody.
There are plenty of people. Maybe he's given, I think the extent of where he might have influenced anybody is like, people thinking about like 3D printing a ghost gun and a suppressor. That's maybe the extent of the novelty of what he did. What his actual actions are is, a tale as old as time. It's a very classic type of politically motivated assassination, which the U.S. also has a very long history of. I also think, it makes a lot of sense that he had encountered the Unabomber's manifesto.
Right.
I love that people found that he'd given 4 stars on Goodreads, that he had sat with that. I was also sort of, even in my little debate with my former student, it was kind of interesting to me that I couldn't tell if it was like a Gen X response that I was having, but, in my household, the Unabomber, I remember those strings of killings and injuries very, very vividly when they happened. I remember his arrest and his sentencing very vividly. But in my household, especially because my dad is sort of shared a background with him. I think he had a physics and math background, went to Harvard. My dad went to MIT. And, in our household, the Unabomber was kind of a misunderstood figure and not necessarily a reviled murderer.
If you separate the words in his writing from, the actions when he isolated himself from society and then became more and more desperate, that he could not get an audience, he could not get attention, he could not be heard.
Right.
And that, in a sense, was another act of self-sacrifice. Dying, not different from all the people who have set themselves on fire to protest the war in Gaza, the vets or the active soldiers who have in recent days set themselves on fire in front of the White House, in front of the courthouse, and it still gets 2 seconds of media time and then it's gone. So unfortunately, this kind of sensational murder or some other sort of sensational act of violence gets much more attention than when the violence is against oneself. A smart politician, maybe a new kind of politician, will seize on this and turn it into a political movement, because the MAGA movement, which is considered a political movement, is not led by a consistent unifying ideology. It's led by hate, a kind of hate against common enemies, common oppressors.
Right, exactly. That's absolutely. And it's I've brought up this example too, again, when you just talk about America and its history here, I don't know how many people have read Thoreau's Plea for Captain John Brown. It's a text that I pretty reluctantly would give to my students. I think the last time I taught it was 7 years ago at Wesleyan University, where I was adjuncting. And I sort of like stopped teaching it, not because like I couldn't stand behind it, but I worried, sometimes students between the ages of 18 to 22 become kind of ideological, and I did kind of see its potential with unstable students. Luckily I didn't have them in my class, but in essence, like I completely agree with what Thoreau is talking about. He's creating a very well thought out argument for cases of necessary violence, and he's using it at he's right outside the gallows where John Brown is getting is due to be killed, and so he's delivering this very moving speech at the final hour on behalf of John Brown, who he also, speaking about like that sort of iconography, he also draws an allusion to John Brown and Christ. And so it's a pretty Christian speech, but it really gets the heart of Christian values, and he's using that to appeal to a public. Like, how can you be for, the mandated execution of someone like this when this person was doing the most Christian thing of all, carrying out the ultimate protest against, a definitely murderous system, a definitely unchristian system, which was slavery. And we could argue that, like, without John Brown's involvement in, say, like Harper's Ferry and various other instances, and obviously John Brown and his boys were very violent. We know that that's definitely been the case. These were not sort of like peaceful demonstrations. They were pretty brutal. But without them, you could argue that maybe the U.S. still would have had some form of slavery. I mean, it was sort of the definitive turning point, and certainly Thoreau believes that. And so, this is a really beautiful document. Yeah, and it could be very relevant to Unabomber. It could be very relevant to Luigi Mangione. It can be used for lots of things. Obviously, it could be used also for horrible things like defending abortion clinic bombings too. But here I think it's really relevant because, again, it's like, okay, someone had to do a sort of unpleasant. I don't think anyone likes the idea of murdering anyone. Luigi was someone with a very promising future, just like the way the Unabomber was.
Right.
I mean, these are people that had like these weren't like, these losers who were like unemployed and couldn't find any way of like fitting in society. These are people who could have gotten great jobs and had a thriving life, but it goes back to sacrifice.
In February 25th, 2024, Aaron Bushnell, age 25, same age, a serviceman at the Air Force, set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in D.C. It was live streamed. We watched it. I watched it on X. It was just a horrific thing to see. He didn't hurt anybody except himself, which is the self-sacrifice you're talking about. And he said he was protesting the murders, the deaths of innocents, not terrorists or whatever they're called, but of innocents in Palestine. He doused himself with gasoline and set himself on fire, shouting while burning, "Free Palestine." I mean, it was just a horrific protest to watch. This was the second protest, and I think there's been a third one. There was one in December 2023 in front of the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. My point is, it disappeared. So there is the one that's victimless, which obviously is more honorable. You don't want anyone to die. You don't want a father of two to die, but it disappears. So the fact that Luigi Mangione decided not to do that is informative. It's telling us something about our society, where we ignore protests, even the ones that take the protesters' life. So someone has to up the ante, to get the attention. So like a UPenn graduate went to Stanford. He invented some robotics, super high IQ, super attractive, wealthy family. He was the valedictorian at the Gilman School, the all-boys private school in Baltimore. And so was Ted Kaczynski, by the way. Very similar beginnings. And Kaczynski wrote that imagine a society that subjects people to conditions that make them terribly unhappy and then gives them the drugs that will take away their unhappiness. It's an ongoing protest. Everything is part of the same story. I don't think that these are disparate acts. They are all expressions of the same society that is desperate, that's not been heard, that feels that democracy has been lost, sacrificed since Citizens United to become a plutocracy, that the people with any promise, like Luigi Mangione, are expected to become CEOs. That's the only interesting job other than like AI, top-level tech jobs. The sense of like sacrifice, heroism, causes that are worth dying for, belief in humanity, faith in the social contract have been lost. And the people, the masses, all of us, feel unrepresented. The only thing you can do is get angry and vote against or act against all kinds of things, like Aaron Bushnell did, like Luigi Mangione did. That's it. We're not given an option for whatever we believe in anymore. It's gone.
So true. Exactly. I think, and I think it's like young people are going to feel this even more and more. You know, I mean, what do you do when you really feel like there is no way to send a message otherwise? I think they're going to really pull like a big mental health-ish thing here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's going to be interesting how that plays out. He's a little bit older than the age where people get diagnosed with like severe mental health issues, like say schizophrenia. So he's a little bit out of those sort of that sort of spectrum. But I think they're going to try to portray him that way. I think he probably wouldn't want that, and I think there'd be a lot of evidence that he wasn't mentally unfit when he did this. Maybe they could say he was agitated physically because of his health issues. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. And I think what you bring up with the jury is kind of interesting.
The other thing is, I don't know if you saw, but the DA bringing the charges against him. Her brother went to Brown, actually, and I think her name is Rebecca Tisch. They're related to the Tisch family, the famous billionaire family.
Oh, my God.
Her brother is a healthcare CEO. That's who's representing the case for the people.
That's hilarious. Oh my God.
And I don't know enough about the couple who are defending him. The wife, as his defense attorney, who has been joined by her husband, who is a federal defense attorney. She's a state defense attorney. Now that the federal crimes have been added, and he will have a state trial along with a federal trial. So the husband is the attorney defending P. Diddy, and they both worked in the New York prosecutor's office for years. So the whole thing is suspicious. Like the system is closing ranks on both sides, and the DA gave a speech, asking again for the harshest possible penalty. That, seems to me the wrong tactic, considering that according to an Emerson College, 41% of adults along the U.S. under the age of 30 consider the killing of Brian Thompson justifiable.
I mean, they really can't control public opinion like they want to. What do you do when you have a population that now feels like they have nothing to lose? I think that's the thing that Americans have to think about. If you're creating for people a future where everything is basically hopeless, then what's going to stop people from these sort of symbolic acts? I don't think Luigi went into this thinking he's going to be famous now as less like incredible folk hero or whatever. I think he felt he had to do what he needed to do to send a message, and that people weren't doing it enough. Yeah, exactly. In another world, this would have just been a social media post, right? But we're well beyond that. How is our system going to stop more people from doing this stuff? If people really feel like they don't have a future, that their life is truly screwed up, that, someone this privileged can feel like, there really maybe isn't much there for him outside of an action like this, then you're going to see a ton of this kind of stuff. Exactly what the system is afraid of. But the only people that should be afraid, I think, are the people who are the actual murderers, which are people like the healthcare CEOs. I don't know how to justify, like, how could someone go into an industry like that and feel good about themselves, showing up every day? They want to portray him as Brian Thompson as like a family man, right?
By the way, he was charged with insider trading. He sold like $10 million of stock when he was sued by the LA firefighters union before he disclosed it to the shareholders. The shareholders of United being mostly pensioner funds, retirement funds. So we have no say in how our pensions are being invested. That's part of like this whole insider clique, this corporatocracy that we've become, where anyone who fights against the system that puts profits over people's lives, private profits over the public's lives, is going to now be a terrorist. So any anti-corporate act, it's going to send you to prison or to the death penalty, because we have to shut up and accept the corporate overlords and never question gangster capitalism or rentier capitalism that makes more and more people dependent on those overlords. Don't own your own home. Don't have homestead protections. Depend on the system for that monthly paycheck, without which you can't live, because you don't have land, you can't grow your own food. it's closing in on the individual. The point is, we have been a certain way for thousands of years, and people are not suddenly going to assume that this is the norm. People will organize against this.
I think the future is going to find more and more people involved in all sorts of forms of protest, and some of the forms of protest people aren't going to like. When people are like speaking out against these sort of acts of senseless violence, it's like America is already violent. Like, we have the most violent culture. So I don't even, this sort of thing where it's like this shock over a assassination like this is like just crazy to me, where you have a country where like gun violence is normalized. I saw a bunch of like Gen Z kids making like social media posts like that really hit home for me, because it was like they were saying like, oh yeah, we have our entire childhood been used to school shooter drills. We have dealt with the reality that every day we go to school, we can be shot and our friends could be murdered and our teachers could be killed. Like, this is a reality. This is the violent reality that is our American life. So now you're telling us that this is somehow an aberration, that we shouldn't stand for this, when we are like the society that says literally just showing up to school is a place where you can just like lose your life, So it's like, yeah, this, like, I want people to like spare us this whole thing about, oh, not in America. It's like, America is like the most violent society. Of course, things like this have happened and will happen and will continue to happen. So that the pearl clutching is what really gets me. But I like that for once, increasingly I feel, and I wonder if you feel this too, my whole life I felt like most of my views are in a fringe and in a minority. I often always feel like somewhere in a sort of left like silo, right? But increasingly these days, I find that more and more people are joining the world that I'm in. So it feels like increasingly like a majority of this country has come to the same conclusions that I've come to. So that's been really interesting. I certainly didn't see that coming. I didn't think that could be a possible byproduct of the pandemic or whatever, but just that more and more we're finding that our positions are held by the vast majority. That's pretty exciting. And that's when you can actually have real protests, real uprising, real revolution, is when it's the majority of the people against this like small 1%. That's like, Trump has a fake version of this kind of revolution, but this is a like much larger revolution that can involve much more people, a general population.
Exactly.
So this is, it's just, so people should see, as much as they want to seem distraught over people celebrating murder or whatever they think. I think the praise that Luigi got here should seem encouraging to people, only in that it's like a true protest against the healthcare industry, and the message is being sent loud and clear. So that can cause change. Like, his action actually can cause change, and some people, maybe mostly the media, can't handle that reality. But it's not up to them. The wheels are already turning, and people are already in that radical space right now. This is now things. Once you get over that, oh no, I don't want to be a person that condones murder. Once you look past it, once you get to a place like Thoreau did and Plea for Captain John Brown, where he actually can see an argument, even as a Christian, for necessary violence, then there's a whole other thing. That's the same realm we're in when we say Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Everyone's going to say Israel has a right to defend themselves, and so do Palestinians. So, cannot say that armed resistance is going to be illegal when it's like the people you don't want doing it. Like, that's, all of these things are forms of armed resistance. What Luigi did is a form of armed resistance. This is a different, but the funny thing is, it's again, the media being weird about this. It's kind of funny because it's very much on America's terms. America's very violent terms. This is already a society that has the violence in its blood, in its culture, in its entertainment, in all of politics. So it should be seen as homegrown and intrinsic to our society. So yeah, that part shouldn't surprise anyone.
Trump's only power, all Trump has had since his political career, is fame. It's name recognition. He had spent decades acquiring fame and name recognition, and that's what he used, and he went with whatever he thought would get him votes. Opportunism.
Right.
Name recognition is unfortunately the currency, and now takes an act of violence and an act of murder to get that similar type of like fame, infamy, and in a kind of like anti-Warholian thing. Fame and infamy have overlapped. Trump is proof of that. You have the name recognition. It no longer seems to mind, to our culture, how you got it. So yeah, I think he has already become a symbol. I mean, he was a symbol before we knew his name. When we saw the deposed, denied event, we scratched on the bullets. We were
Yeah.
all like, oh, this guy's too smart. He's already in Canada. He's a no extradition country. We already knew that if he gets caught, it's because he wants to get caught.
Exactly. He had an opportunity to,
Hmm.
flee the country, which I thought was what he was doing. But
Oh
it's
yeah, he had
interesting.
like, I don't know, $10,000 in cash, and he had the fake IDs, and he had like foreign
Right.
currency. So what was he doing at McDonald's in Pennsylvania 5 days later?
Presence of McDonald's and all this is also kind of funny because it's like was so key in Trump's like image, and then here he is. We catch our assassin in a very middle of the road city in Pennsylvania, and about McDonald's.
And you saw that McDonald's got terrible reviews after it went
Oh,
on
right.
Yelp and gave it like an review for snitching.
Right, exactly. I mean, the snitching thing I think is also very funny because I think, like in my circles in New York, at least, there was this idea that probably plenty of people interacted with him in New York, but New York's always been a city where people don't snitch. Everybody
Oh
knows
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
People don't
yeah.
get involved in these sort of things. So it kind of made sense to a lot of people I spoke to that, oh yeah, once he left New York, if he had stayed in New York, he could have possibly not been caught.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever on the side of the system here.
We start
Interesting.
snitching on each other, there is no social contract left.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, exactly.
our commitment is to each other. Obviously, it's not
Right.
to authorities. It never has been. So if the police want to catch him, they can do their job.
Right.
A citizen, I would never determine a person's destiny based on a photo released by the police in the
Right.
news. I would never take that responsibility. The McDonald's employee who did call the police was expecting the $60,000 reward and apparently doesn't qualify for it. I forget, I don't know if you
Yeah.
remember the
Yeah,
fine
yeah.
points of it, but somehow ironically did not qualify for it.
Yeah, and I can't tell if it was the employee or an elderly customer that saw him.
Elderly customer went and told the employee.
Oh, I see.
And
Right.
then the employee called the local police. It was kind of interesting that they did it for the money, and it was a lot of money, and this is someone obviously who has no money, so they saw this, and that's how the system gets the cooperation of the citizens. It's not really citizens in support of the police, it's citizens wanting to get that 60,000.
I just saw also online, like people are actually getting Luigi Mangione tattoos now.
There is a TikTok video that has gone viral, which is the Luigi Mangione escape. And the video says, the thing was like, Luigi Mangione has escaped custody. This is real and confirmed by a friend at the bureau. And then they have, I guess, AI, but they have Luigi Mangione in his red jumpsuit, pushing away the police and jumping on a boat and taking off on the Hudson River and disappearing. So folk fantasy.
Well, I think it really coincides too with like the young people's disdain for celebrity culture. That's another thing that's been very emblematic of our times is that, celebrities no longer have the power that they used to, or it's starting to shift at least, because we know that Gen Z just isn't impressed by celebrity endorsements, or they know very clearly how celebrity works on social media. So they don't buy it in the same way. And they always hold celebrities accountable for their actions. So there's been a sort of, also a certain sort of mandate in the last few years where it's like, we don't want celebrities anymore. And so this type of guy, just like a regular guy who was not a celebrity, rising to fame for a very principled act in their eyes is really also very perfect too. That's
like,
really the folk hero story.
Tons of people, like millions of people, I think, offered to pay his legal costs, and they
donated to his commissary fund.
Everybody's donating wherever they can come up. Can see a link. And his lawyer, the previous lawyer, the Pennsylvania lawyer, who I thought was absolutely charming. The one that sounded like Joe Pesci, that guy.
Yeah.
And he said, well, the Supreme Court says that billionaires can give millions and millions to candidates, and that's their free speech. So maybe the public is exercising like their free speech by sending money to Luigi's legal costs.
I mean, it also tells you about a public that's dealt with incarceration enough that they know to do that, and to also donate to the commissary. Like the fact that people are fluent in what happens when you go to jail is also kind of depressing, but also, it says a lot about our culture. We live in a culture where there's a heavy sense of carceral like duty and outcome to any action election where we have too much police, too many prisons. And so, people are going to try to do whatever they can to get in the way of that. And I'm sure he's getting all sorts of marriage proposals. And
yeah, there will be a lot of that.
uh,
Whatever
that,
happens to him, there will be a lot of marriage marital options.
oh yeah. He definitely will find his way towards a partner, I'm sure, while even in prison. I still feel sad that that's going to be his life, but I think that I'll be interested to see what the first interviews with him are like. I think he will do an interview at some point, and I'd be curious to see what that
I
sounds like.
just want the trial televised. That's all.
Yeah,
I
same.
really hope for like a Judge Ito who will say yes to the cameras. It will be like the trial of this century.
I mean, he was very vocal. Remember, he was shouting right outside of.
Yes.
I think he's ready to be quite vocal. I think, unlike the Unabomber, who is less likely to speak out, I think he has some things to say. I'm certainly going to be listening.
Well, maybe you could be selected for the jury.
Well, that's the funny thing. I've been reading articles already about how they're so worried that they're not going to find people that are, neutral enough, that everybody's already too sympathetic to him. I mean, how can you live in America and not have dealt with the horrors of the healthcare industry? So,
ultimate sacrifice, if you're selected, I'm telling you now, you have to delete your profile on X.
yeah,
hide everything. Archive it for now. You don't have to destroy it.
Yeah, exactly.
Appear to have no ill will toward health insurance companies.
Yes.
Don't show your intentions and stay through the trial. And
exactly.
then talk to your fellow jurors. That's the only way at this stage, is that people commit for the trial that's going to be in New York. Because the thing is the administration is going to change. So the new DOJ bringing these federal charges, and that's the ultimate betrayal by the Democrats, by the way, is going to be the Trump DOJ. So they've brought the federal charges. Biden did, supposedly has been a progressive president. Another of the numerous examples of the lack of any progressive credentials at all. They have been 100% pro-corporate America.
So true. God.
Yeah.
We live in very interesting times.
We were like in a non-stop Trump in the news. Suddenly, this kid and the photographs and his words and his actions and his back condition, all of it has been such a shift.
Yeah, it's refreshing.
The only victim we had was like Trump.
Yeah. We now have a hero we can stand behind. Hopefully, we'll see.
We definitely have to get back to this conversation and continue it. Maybe when the trial is taking place.
Oh my God!
Talk about it and have part 2 of our Luigi Mangione conversation.
It has my attention 100%. I felt more fluid on this issue than most issues. I've been on it since the moment that happened. So yeah, for sure.
Oh, and that X-ray of the vertebrae on his X profile. I mean,
the
whole
my
thing.
God, incredible.
Yeah.
It's just perfect. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes, to be continued.
Yeah, to be continued. And everybody out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And until next week, keep speaking up.
Yeah.